I was too young to understand what it truly meant to pull the trigger when I went off to that war. I thought courage was something you carried in your chest like an invisible medal, that bravery was following orders without thinking, without flinching. I grew up hearing stories of heroes, of just battles, of victories that cleansed the soul of an entire people. And so, with my head full of noble ideas and my hands still clean, I set out for a place where the sky seemed to weigh 3 times as heavy, where the earth was soaked with blood and dust, where time was no longer measured by days, but by the number of promises death tore from us. In the first months, I did everything as I was told. I obeyed, I fought, I shot. I saw the eyes of young men fade before me like candles snuffed out by a merciless wind, and I hardened. I learned to harden because that's what was expected of us. War didn't ask for explanations or tears. It demanded efficiency. It demanded silence. It demanded that we bury any shred of compassion in the darkest depths of our souls and forget it ever existed. But you couldn't forget for long. With every mission, every village we marched through, every anonymous face that crossed our path, something began to crack inside me. Small fissures, invisible at first, but gradually letting through things I no longer knew how to contain. The sweet stench of death, the glassy eyes of those with no choice, the silent tremor of a comrade's hands as he cleaned blood from his shirt. We didn't talk about it. Fear, doubt, exhaustion, everything was buried beneath the steel mask we had to wear every day. And I got used to it, or at least I thought I had. Until the day I found myself alone in the smoke, separated from my unit, my rifle heavy in my hands, the sound of my own blood pounding in my ears, staring at a boy on the other side of the line, just as lost as I was. In that moment, between the grip on the trigger and the dull thud of reality, I understood. There was a part of me the war hadn't managed to kill. I should have shot. That's what they trained me to do, what echoed in every muscle of my memory like a conditioned reflex, unquestionable. The boy in front of me wore a tattered, mud and blood-stained uniform, his face pale and scratched as if the earth itself had tried to swallow him. He was trembling, barely able to hold himself up, yet still trying to keep his rifle aimed at me with hands that could hardly stay open. He was too young to carry a weapon, too young to know death up close, too young even to inspire fear. And in that instant when our eyes met, the whole world seemed to stop breathing. There was no sound of distant explosions, no muffled shout from the radio clipped to my belt. There was only the two of us, 2 boys too old to dream and too young to carry true hatred. My finger itched on the trigger. One movement, one single nervous command, and the story would end there. No witnesses, no complications, just another number added to the report, another justification scribbled in the margins of war. But I hesitated. I saw in his eyes something that unnerved me in a way no training could have prepared me for. Fear, yes, but also a silent plea, an exhaustion so deep it seemed to mirror my own. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't defiance. It was just the raw truth of 2 tired bodies, 2 hearts beating too fast, 2 lives that in another place might have shared a beer, swapped lies about past loves, talked about the rain and homesickness. Exhaled slowly and lowered my rifle. The boy blinked, confused, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And I, standing there with my heart racing and my throat tight, realized there was no going back. In that moment, between the choice to kill or to recognize the humanity in another, an invisible line was crossed inside me. A line that no uniform in the world could ever erase. Without a word, I took a step back, slowly raising my hands to show I was no threat. And with a knot tightening in my chest, I watched the boy collapse to his knees in the mud. Not as a defeated enemy, but as someone who by a small and silent miracle had been seen. I could have turned my back. I could have left the boy there, abandoned to the fate that until that moment I'd been taught was inevitable for anyone on the other side of the line. But something inside me, something old and nagging like a poorly healed wound, wouldn't let me move on. There was something too wrong about leaving him there, so exposed, so fragile, so absurdly human. And in that brief space of hesitation, in that silent moment when the war seemed as distant as a nightmare told by other lips, I knew I'd already chosen, even if I didn't yet have the courage to admit it. I took a deep breath, lowered my rifle further until it touched the ground, and knelt in front of him. The boy looked at me with wide eyes, a mix of fear and disbelief, as if waiting for a blow, a shot, anything that made sense within the brutal logic we knew. But I just extended my hand. He didn't take it right away. We stayed there, tethered to each other like two castaways about to drown, until, very slowly, he dragged himself toward me, leaving his weapon behind in the mud. When he finally touched my hand, I felt how much he was trembling from pain, from cold, from fear, and perhaps also from the same strange hope that, against all reason, was beginning to grow inside me. I pulled him up with effort, feeling the weight of his thin, wounded body against mine, and without thinking about maps, borders, flags, or protocols, I began leading him away from the open field, toward the dense forest that rose like a silent shelter. Every step was a risk. Every breath seemed to echo too loudly among the twisted trees. I knew that if any of my own found this boy at my side, no explanation would save me. It would be considered treason. It would be considered madness. And yet, there I was, marching beside someone who, until a few hours ago, should have been just another number silently crossed out in the ledger. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his story. I only knew he was my enemy, and that, somehow I didn't yet understand, he was also my brother. In the days that followed, the world shrank for me, until it fit into a tiny space between the trees and the boy's labored breathing. We were hidden in a forgotten patch of forest, far from patrolled routes, surrounded by a solitude so thick it sometimes felt like time itself had folded over us. He barely spoke. Neither did I. Words, so plentiful among comrades in the trenches, now seemed an unnecessary, almost dangerous luxury. Our communication was glances, gestures, slow movements to avoid the dry snap of twigs underfoot. Each time his knees buckled and he fell, I lifted him without a word. Each time fever burned through his body and he thrashed in nightmares I couldn't understand. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and waited for it to pass. I didn't know what I expected to find in him. Maybe resentment, maybe defiance. But what I found was something much simpler and far more devastating. A boy trying to survive. Sometimes in the mornings when the fog spread thick among the trees, I caught him watching me sidelong, as if he still couldn't believe I wouldn't turn him in. And in those moments, it was as if an invisible bridge was being built between us, stone by stone, hesitation by hesitation. It wasn't friendship yet. It was something more primal, a mutual need, a silent recognition that to keep breathing, we'd have to trust each other. I fed him with the little I had. I shared my water. I tore strips from my own shirt to bind his wounds. It was little, almost nothing, but it was enough to keep him on his feet, and strangely, it was also enough to keep a part of me alive, the part the war had tried to bury under layers of hatred, fear, and blind obedience. At night, when the cold sank into our bones and the sky folded silently over our heads, I stayed awake, listening to his heavy breathing, counting his disjointed whispers, and thinking of all the things no one taught us to see when they sent us to fight, that the enemy bleeds the same, fears the same, dreams the same, and it was there, lost in that indifferent forest far from flags and anthems, that I began to realize I was no longer a soldier, not in the way they taught me. I was just a man, caring for another man, in a desperate attempt to save the little humanity still left in us. As the days passed, the silence between us stopped being a barrier and became a refuge. There was a strange peace in that forced coexistence, as if we both knew that as long as we were together, as long as we shared the same fear, the same hunger, the same cold, we'd be, in some way, invincible against the brutality surrounding us. Gradually, timid gestures replaced mistrust. A piece of bread shared without hesitation, a canteen offered without words, a brief glance heavy with something beyond the physical need for survival. We began to recognize each other's pain, not as enemies, but as two men torn from their lives and thrown into a war that no longer made sense. On a particularly cold afternoon, he handed me something he'd kept in the pocket of his tattered uniform, a crumpled, almost illegible photograph of a family smiling under a clear sky. He pointed to the image with trembling fingers, murmuring words I barely understood. It didn't matter. I understood enough to feel the knot tighten in my throat. He had a home, a mother, maybe siblings. He had roots, dreams, just like me. He wasn't just a soldier on the wrong side of the trench. He was a son, maybe an older brother, maybe a friend who promised to come back and who, like me, now didn't know if he'd get the chance. I handed the photo back carefully, as if it were made of glass. He smiled, not a wide smile, but one of those smiles felt more in the eyes than on the lips. And in that moment, I knew something irrevocable had broken inside me. There was no longer us and them. There were no sides, there were no victors, just survivors carrying broken pieces of who we were and trying, with bare hands, to build something that made sense amid the chaos. But war doesn't forget those who try to abandon it. We began to hear, in the distance, the sound of patrols advancing, the metallic creak of vehicles cutting through the forest, the dry crackle of radios breaking the silence. We were surrounded. Every night was a gamble against time, against hunger, against the invisible death lurking in the shadows. And with every step, with every decision, the brutal realization grew in me. Sooner or later, I'd have to choose, not between two sides, but between loyalty to a uniform and allegiance to what my heart, now irrevocably awake, recognized as truth. There was no clear warning, no dramatic moment like in the movies we watched as boys. The decision came as great. Changes do in real life, silent, inevitable, creeping inside, like an underground river, until there was no denying its current. That morning we woke to the distinct sound of voices approaching, familiar voices, voices in English, voices of men who, in another time, I'd have called brothers. My first instinct was the one they drilled into me. Raise the weapon, identify the enemy, act without thinking. But when I looked to the side and saw the boy, thin, dirty, still clutching that crumpled photograph to his chest as if it could protect him, I knew, with a searing clarity, that the real enemy was no longer in front of me. The enemy was the fear they taught us to cultivate. It was the manufactured hatred. It was the comfortable indifference that let men kill other men without ever having to look them in the eye. He looked at me, waiting. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Everything that needed saying was already etched in the space between us. In the shared days of hunger, the wounds hastily treated, the nights when the cold nearly broke us and yet we survived. I felt the crushing weight of the choice before me, turn the boy in and be welcomed back as a loyal soldier, or protect him and forever bear the mark of one who saw the enemy as a brother. There would be no absolution, there would be no recognition, just the solitary knowledge of having done what was right in a world that had long forgotten the meaning of the word. I stood slowly, signaling for him to stay behind me. The sound of boots crushing vegetation grew closer, more urgent. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought the others might hear it. With a tense motion, I took the rifle from my shoulder and dropped it to the ground. Then I looked at him, not as a soldier looking at his adversary, but as a man looking at another man, and extended my hand. Without hesitation he took it, and together with our eyes fixed on the unknown stretching ahead, we began to run. We ran without looking back. Every root that tripped us, every branch that scratched our skin, was a brutal reminder that there was no longer protection, no safe home waiting for us. The sound of the soldiers spread through the forest like broken thunder, shouts of command ricocheting among the trees, orders to hunt, to encircle, to finish the job. But I didn't really hear any of it. What echoed inside me was something more primal, the sound of my own breath tearing through my lungs, the wild beating of my heart, the unshakable certainty that for the first time I was fighting not for flags or invisible medals, but for something that was mine, only mine, the dignity of choosing what kind of man I wanted to be. The boy stumbled once, twice, and each time he fell, I went back, pulling him to his feet as if pulling a part of myself. He didn't complain, didn't cry, just kept following, his eyes wide but steady, as if he knew it wasn't just his life in my hands, it was also my redemption. We pushed forward through hidden trails, fleeing like two desperate ghosts, until the sound of the hunters began to fade into the distance, swallowed by the thickness of the forest and the mercy of time. When we finally stopped, both exhausted, doubled over our own knees, the world seemed small and silent again. The sky opened in grey slivers between the trees, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the metallic taste of fear still stuck to my tongue. I threw myself onto my back on the ground, feeling every bone protest, and closed my eyes, allowing myself, for one fragile moment, to believe we'd made it. But the truth was harsher. There was no true escape. No matter how many miles we put between us and the army I'd served, the mark of the choice I'd made would be etched in me forever. I knew that if I returned, I'd be a traitor. If I was captured, I'd be judged not just by the rules of war, but by the silent betrayal of the pact I'd made with my comrades. And yet, looking to the side and seeing that boy breathing alive, clinging to the last thread of hope the war hadn't managed to tear from him, I knew, with a heavy and irreversible peace, I'd do it all again. That was the war that mattered. And for the first time since I set foot on that ravaged field, I knew I was winning it. The escape lasted no more than a few days, but it felt like an eternity. Every moment was too heavy, as if time dragged itself over us, insisting on reminding us of the risk, the fragility of our condition. We weren't just running from the army behind us anymore. Now, we were running from reality. We were running from a future we no longer knew, from an identity that now felt disjointed, shattered by our own actions. I knew I could never go back to who I was before. A soldier, a patriot, someone who believed victory was more important than the lives lost along the way. There was no longer room for the man I'd been, and perhaps no room for the man I could become. There was a fine line between survival and surrender, and we had crossed that line with every step we took together. But the weight of carrying that choice was a burden no one else could understand. In the end, it wasn't the soldiers behind us that haunted us. It was the idea that if we were caught, if someone discovered what I'd done, there would be no redemption. There would be no way to justify what was right and what was wrong when you dared to save someone who, by all standards, was supposed to be destroyed. And then came the worst. The point where, looking back, I knew there was no escape left. They were ahead of us, the sound of hooves and voices firm and certain, cutting through the air. I felt despair in my throat tightening, trying to keep my mind from collapsing. The boy looked at me, his eyes wide, still mixed with fear, but now also with a silent trust I never imagined could come from someone like him. He didn't ask if we should fight, didn't demand explanations. He just prepared himself, and in Doing so gave me the strength I didn't know I still had. With a heavy sigh, I returned to the line, the rifle now feeling more like a burden than a resource. We didn't know what was coming. We didn't know what our choices would bring, but one thing was certain. We were together until the end. That I knew. Together we could face even the impossible. And maybe, just maybe, we could still find a way to turn the page, to let the story we were writing have an ending that was truly ours. They surrounded us with the precision of a clock. There was no more escaping, no more running. The field was closed. The sky seemed lower, as if the whole world had shrunk to that moment. My lungs were heavy, and my mind tried uselessly to find a way out. I looked at the boy now standing beside me, his breathing ragged and his eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. He wasn't trembling anymore. He wasn't afraid anymore. Somewhere, along our escape, he had transformed, or maybe it was I who had changed. It didn't matter. We were there at the end of everything, facing whatever came. Like brothers, the sound of the soldiers' boots grew closer, and then, as if the war within me had dissipated all at once, a strange calm took over. The weight of what would happen next no longer troubled me. I wasn't afraid of death anymore. I was afraid of what I'd lose if I stopped following this final truth, the truth that to free myself, to restore my soul, I needed to act, no longer as a soldier, but as a man, as someone who saw in the other, in the enemy, something that was never taught, something the war tried to tear from all of us, humanity. The patrol captain approached, his voice deep and authoritative, cutting through the air. "Take them both," he ordered. The boy was shoved forward, but something in me snapped. I could no longer let him be treated as just another piece on the board of a game that was never mine. With a quick movement, I stepped in front of him, shielding him with my own body. I was no longer a soldier. I was no longer the man who followed orders without question. I was the man who chose, and in that moment, I chose. "I won't allow it," I said, my voice steadier than any of us could have imagined, the fear vanishing. "I'm responsible for him. He won't be taken, not like this." My heart pounded faster, and the soldiers looked at each other, surprised by the resistance. I was no longer playing by the rules of war. I was making my own. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew what I had to do. I knew that by protecting that boy, by standing before them all, I was standing before myself, and there was no going back. Suddenly a stillness settled. They stepped back, not out of fear, but out of respect, and in that silence, with the sound of my own words still echoing in the air, I knew the war, the real war, had ended inside me. I was no longer part of an endless conflict. I had freed myself, and as the boy looked at me with eyes that said more than words could express, I finally saw. I saw the truth I couldn't see during all those years of fighting. The enemy was never the other. The enemy was always what they taught us to be. And by breaking that, by protecting someone presented to me as something to be destroyed, I had won. He went home, but the home he found was no longer the same. The streets, the faces, the familiar things now seemed like shadows of a life he barely recognized. The veteran carried more than medals and physical scars. He carried the weight of a man who had seen himself in the face of the enemy and, for the first time, asked who he really was. There was no longer honor on the battlefield. The true honor, he had learned, was in the silence of the choice, in the moment when the war within him ended, and he looked at the other with the same eyes he looked at himself. Now, the memories of the war no longer weighed like stones in the depths of his chest. They were scars, distant reminders of a time that could no longer be erased. The young soldier he saved was no longer an enemy, but a friend. And that act of humanity, that simple gesture of protecting instead of destroying, had forever changed the way he saw the world. When he closed his eyes, he knew that no matter how much the past had marked him, he had broken free from the endless cycle of hatred. And now, instead of living in the shadow of war, he lived in a peace he had earned himself.